Hello everyone, welcome and welcome back to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli, I'm in São Paulo, Brazil. This podcast is produced by myself, Philip Cunliffe, who's in Canterbury, and George Hoare, who's in London. Today, this episode is about British history. We're going to be talking to David Edgerton, professor at King's College London and a historian who's written various books, including The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, The Shock of the Old, Technology and Global History since 1900, Britain's War Machine, Weapons, Resources, and Experts in the Second World War, amongst others. Because it's primarily about Britain, I'm going to be passing on to Phil and George, who are going to do most of the talking here.
So, as people who follow me on social media will know, I'm not shy about sharing my views on things, including on books I don't particularly care for. But I can honestly say that this book, the one we're talking about this evening, The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, is one of the best books I've read in a long time. There's a counterintuitive insight or shift in perspective or critique of the conventional wisdom of British history that trips off virtually every other page. It's a book about myth and reality, and in this case, the myth of British decline and also the reality of the enduring character of British state power, military power, economic growth, and industrial expansion. So there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth just framing this, particularly for non-British listeners. What's at stake here? I think the standard account of British history that you get at school, or at least I can speak for myself, is kings and queens and Second World War. Those are the only two things that you're allowed to study. And by kings and queens, it's almost always Henry VIII and his various wives. But this, of course, is 20th century British history. And I think it's, the standard account of 20th century British history probably features the key dates, maybe 1914, 1945, 1979, 1989. So that, the end of the long 19th century in 1914, 1945, the kind of the end of the Second World War and the building of the welfare state, 1979, when everything gets overturned by Thatcher, and then 1989, which is kind of the end of history, or the kind of the movement into the 90s and the noughties, which is this kind of much more staid period of kind of global neoliberalism. So yeah, I think this book deliberately sets out to question that and to provide a new periodization or a new approach to 20th century British history.
And so much of world history, simply by virtue of Britain's place in the world throughout the 20th century, is obviously refracted through British history itself. The world wars, imperial or the rise and fall of the European colonial empires, the relative relegation of Europe as the center of the world economy, Britain's diminution as a superpower. The rise of global neoliberalism is often told as the story of Thatcher in Britain and Reagan in the US. Yeah. And then the development of a new kind of social democracy, the third way as envisioned by Tony Blair and New Labour in the late 90s and early 2000s, a new form of centre-left politics. So much of the theme, all the many themes that we talk about consistently on the podcast are refracted through the history of Britain in the 20th century. And that's what we're going to, David.
I guess it always feels like, the history of your country is no other country lives in its history quite so much as Britain. But all of these questions, and I think this come through in the chat, they're all still relevant today. Questions about decline, is Britain still a great power? The questions of welfare or warfare, which were taken in the book, the idea of RNHS and the centrality of the welfare state to the kind of the British collective identity even today. All of these things, I think, which are so important today, are all discussed and dissected in the book, and many of the conventional wisdoms also overturned.
And it seems, Phil especially has been going on about this book to me for quite a while, and often the emphasis on like Britain's role in the world, how powerful or not Britain is, often plays into, if we're talking about contemporary politics, into kind of, the Brexiteers talking up Britain and how powerful Britain is, and seemingly Remainers trying to do down Britain and saying, well, we're actually part of Europe, we're not that important. And actually this book seems to kind of flip that on its head in certain ways, or at least ask probing questions about exactly that sort of portrayal. So I think there's a lot of contemporary relevance to how we interpret Britain's history and Britain's role in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got David to talk us through that stuff.
Hi, David. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much. Look forward to the discussion.
So to get started, I actually had occasion in preparation for this to revisit your book, The Shock of the Old, which I read around the time it came out, and it was kind of quite nice to revisit it. And so you're obviously known as a historian of technology with books such as The Shock of the Old, and as well as on Britain's 20th century warfare state and British technological history and so on. What prompted you to compose the more synthetic history of Britain over the 20th century?
Well, the honest answer is I was asked to do it. It didn't occur to me that I should do something as madly ambitious as that. But I've been writing in a reasonably synthetic way about the history of 20th century Britain really since my first book, which is called England and the Aeroplane, which came out in 1991, and which argued for the existence of a powerful British warfare state and for a technocratic state, particularly after 1945. So this book stands in quite a line of books questioning the standard narratives of 20th century British history, and I saw the form of the national history as a good way to get my story across to a wider academic public and indeed a wider general public as well. So I was using a conventional form to tell a non-conventional story.
So the story of Britain in the 20th century, it's typically seen, this story is seen as the long decline of the British Empire and Britain's diminution from the status of global superpower, despite victory in 2 world wars. And I was thinking also, I was trying to think about comparative decline, kind of, I suppose, and with the partial exception perhaps of the Suez Crisis, Britain endures no colonial defeats on the scale of Dien Bien Phu or Algeria, as say the French endured. So when I was preparing notes for this podcast, I was trying to think of any other country that has endured such a radical diminution in its global significance and clout in such a short space of time. And the only country I could think of is perhaps Russia in recent times, or maybe China in the 19th century, and perhaps Germany in the 20th. It's not something that you talk about a great deal in the book, and I was wondering if you think there's any value in undertaking such comparisons.
I would add France to that list. I mean, relative decline is not unique to the British case. I mean, I think the book is comparative in lots of ways. I swear don't advertise the fact. I think the comparative stuff is there, but the bigger point is that I think we generally take a very parochial view of British history, and if we made these comparisons, a lot of the sillier arguments would simply not arise. But let me just put in a slight caveat on your framing of the book, or as a contribution to a debate about decline. I mean, that's just part of the story, because there's a very, very, very strong strand of 20th century British historiography which is a positive story, and it's the story of the rise of the welfare state, at least until the Thatcher years. So we've had two stories running alongside each other, and indeed combined, the rise of welfare story and the decline of power story. And I want to criticize both stories, as well as the standard interconnected variant of these stories.
So the whole thrust of your argument is and I obviously take your point, what you're saying about the rise of welfare and Thatcherism and so on, but a lot of the thrust of your argument seems to be to cut against the story of Britain's decline in the 20th century, and this narrative of declinism.
Well, I'm not sure about that. You see, I think a lot of reviewers have seen it in that way. I mean, often people who still think that the declinist historiography is a living force. I mean, I think it isn't a living force. I think I and others disposed of it fairly effectively in the early 1990s. So I want, that's the reason I want to resist this framing of the book, because it engages in a way, it doesn't engage in the decline debate, but it does engage in a lot of other stories, some of which are related to the decline debate, but the stories that stand on their own. I mean, the nature of the British nation, the nature of the British Empire, British exceptionalism, all sorts of issues. I hope come to the fore in the book, and it's certainly not framed around the decline issue. It is one of the literatures that I criticize, and I'd say two things about declinism. I think one is that it set out to explain something which didn't happen, the absolute decline of the United Kingdom, or versions of the relative decline which didn't happen either. And it typically explained that decline that didn't happen with explanations that don't work. Now, in most of the historiography today, the idea that Britain declined is not one that people entertain, so that people aren't setting out to explain the British decline. But a lot of the explanations of the British decline have acquired a life of their own. Certain kinds of stories about the British elite, about British schools, about British universities, about British business. And if I take anything on related to decline in this book, it's some of those stories that are not necessarily regarded as declinist at all, which is why some declinists come back at me and say, well, you haven't talked about the city. Isn't it obvious that the city has held back British industry right through the 20th century? And so, well, no, it isn't. And I do argue against that thesis. Isn't it interesting that you haven't noticed that, and so on?
So I suppose you obviously, I defer to your characterization of the historiography, and I know from my own work, you were publishing materials on liberal militarism and the British warfare state in the early 1990s. So, but notwithstanding that, I suppose the historiographical debate is separate from the debate in popular consciousness, and this is what I think the way in which decline plays into continuing popular consciousness of Britain's place in the world, how it's changed over time, how the media frames particular narratives, how politicians frame the story of what's happened to Britain over recent decades. That still seems to me to be very powerful and important, independently of the historiographical development, even right up to, think of Dominic Cummings, for instance, who he seems to have played into those old stories about the effete character of British schools and higher education compared to the superior technical and scientific training of Britain's competitors. So all of those tropes seem to me to be very present still in public debate.
Yes, but one has to be very careful. I mean, you're absolutely right about Dominic Cummings. He is a low grade C.P. Snow, and C.P. Snow is a pretty low grade intellectual himself. But there's a lot more to be said about thinking about decline in the present conjuncture. One of the most interesting developments has been the use of the term declinist by Brexiters, to condemn Remainers, and they've developed this historical argument that 1960s declinism was the ideology of people who wanted to go into the common market, as it was typically called then, and that Remainers today are also declinists, and declinists are people who do Britain down. Yeah. Brexiters see the inherent strength of the United Kingdom and argue that that strength needs to be released through Brexit. So I've had the rather interesting experiences of some of my own work being taken up by Brexiteers, precisely because it is it's seen as anti-declinist.
So just one thing though before we get into Brexit. So because it seems to me, though you do take up a narrative of decline towards the end of the book, you're very scathing about the political transformations wrought under New Labour. You're attentive to deindustrialisation and all the social and economic problems of those regions that came in its wake. You're very sensitive to the kind of transformation of Britain's culture and what you style as the neo-Edwardian character of Britain in the kind of global era of the 1990s and early 2000s. So, I mean, would you accept that it is also a story of decline, a kind of a myth or a relative story, but an absolute story of decline in parts of Britain?
In parts of Britain, yes, but my story isn't a story of decline over the last few decades. I certainly point out that the United Kingdom's labour productivity is behind that of France and Germany, for example. But I also point out, so it's obvious, which is that the economy has continued to grow. So it's not a story of decline. It's, of course, a story of continuing relative decline, certainly by comparison with China. But I don't see that relative decline happening only in the recent past. Indeed, the most spectacular British relative decline took place between 1940 and 1945. I hope my work takes us away from the whole decline an anti-declinist framing. So I don't see it as very, very, very productive. And the key point about relative success and relative decline is that the main cause of that is not anything that happens in Britain, but what happens in the rest of the world. So I define declinism as the incorrect belief that Britain's relative position in the world was determined by Britain, and specifically by British favorites. That's absolutely not the case. I mean, absolutely not the case. There might be a small fraction of the relative decline which is due to British deficiencies. But if the United Kingdom had the most efficient economy in the world today, it would still have declined relatively pretty well as much as it actually has.
And I think that point about the internal or external explanations for relative economic performance, but also relative world prestige of different states is something which, to bring it back just briefly to Brexit, definitely played an important role. And you did kind of mention it earlier, but maybe just to unpack this a little bit. But what do you think the role of some of these declinist narratives have been around Brexit? And I guess in particular, do you think it's maybe the case that liberal Europhile perspective, the kind of hardcore Remainers, that in fact has perhaps the strongest underlying declinist narrative? It's the desire to keep a seat at the top table and punch above our weight through the EU that kind of drives some of that almost frenzy to stay part of this influential club.
Oh yes, I mean, I think that's a very important point, and I think a lot of the arguments for going into the EC in the late 60s and 70s were of exactly that sort. That's to say, this is the only way of preserving British power and perhaps enhancing it as well. And you're very right to point to very, very similar arguments amongst Remainers recently. But I think the most striking aspect of all this is really the Brexiteers taking up an anti-declinist position, because it's not an obvious position for them to take up. In fact, it's a rather silly one, because what it's saying is, actually, we've done very well since Thatcher while being in the EU. So what's the argument for leaving then?
It is quite strange how I think it's almost been in that case that you point out there. It's been a mirror image. It's like if the Brexiteer position is anti-declinist, then the kind of Remain one must be its opposite. There's a kind of it gets quite simplified, obviously, in these kind of debates. But I guess there's not that much reference actually to what's happened over the course of 20th century history, but just the myths and the ideas that we've been taught, I guess.
Absolutely, that's really important. That the Brexit debates have nothing to do with history and actual history, and they have nothing to do with contemporary reality, beyond a superficial similarity in some cases. I think that's very, very important to remember. It is an extraordinarily ideological set of debates. It's and they play on histories which are themselves very, 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 very misleading, and actually different kinds of histories in rather complicated ways. And I think the Brexiteer ideologues tend to be free trading liberals who don't recognise the world has changed, that non-tariff barriers are more important than tariff barriers, and so on, and don't understand the relative decline of the United Kingdom, which is centrally important. And then you have the Brexit voters who've been invited to vote for a nationalist politics, for a return not to the Edwardian years, but I would suggest to the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, when we had a reasonable approximation of a national British economy. And indeed, it's very, very important to note that the people who voted for Brexit are old people. I mean, people who came to maturity in exactly the period I'm referring to. And the division, the political division, ideological division along lines of age seems to me insufficiently commented on. I think it's a fundamentally important change in the nature of our politics and our ideological debates. But it's really important that these older people aren't talking about their own history. They're talking about mythological histories, essentially mythological histories of World War II. And I just wrote a piece for the New Statesman, which Andrew Neil has taken up today and taken offence at. And hundreds of people have chipped in with stories about communist professors doing the country down, and they clearly haven't. What's fascinating, they clearly haven't read the piece because they denounced me for believing things which I obviously don't believe because they're in the article itself, let alone what I've written elsewhere. So there's an incredible kind of sensitivity about the story of. Not the story, a story of World War II, a 1960s and 1970s story of World War II, the kind of Dad's Army version of World War II.
Yeah.
So our political culture is in a very sorry place. I mean, this isn't the political culture you associate with a thrusting, intelligent global elite. This is a political culture you associate with banana monarchy. It's pretty low level stuff, isn't it?
The low level of the elite and public culture in general is something I want to come back to. But just before that, I want to just briefly touch again on how declinism played out with certain factions on the left, kind of somewhat counterintuitively, because it's a story, I suppose, that's frequently associated with the right. But as you mean, we had a Twitter exchange about this, but also, you make a big deal of it in the book, is how important declinism was to the New Left Review, to the Communist Party earlier, when they championed British industry against British globalism and violence along largely nationalist lines, but especially later with the New Left Review. And they took the line, and I'm obviously abbreviating here, but that they saw the failure to crush the aristocracy as warping Britain's national development. And that seems to me to have kind of very specific implications for British left-wing politics, because that view of the Britain kind of lagging behind other industrial powers that had been more successful at modernizing, it seems to me that was that allowed them to stave off radical working class politics, because they were holding out for a fabled bourgeois modernization. And it made them sympathetic, I think, to all sorts of developments, such as New Labour's promises of constitutional renovation, the Charter 88 phenomenon, where there was the push to develop a written British constitution, which has been revived again slightly since Brexit. So all of that seems, the way in which the New Left Review adopted some of these narratives of decline seemed to me to have had important implications for how British left-wing politics played out in the last quarter of the 20th century.
Yes, I very much agree with you. Let me preface my answer by saying that if I were kind of summing up what my book was challenging in the historiography, I would say two things. One, the social democratic rise of the welfare state story, which is the dominant academic story. Yeah? And secondly, the New Left Review, Perry Anderson, Tom Nairn story, developed in the early mid-1960s, which I take to be the richest intellectually of the framings of 20th century and indeed earlier British history. Yes, it's both those things. Now, I do challenge the Nairn Anderson thesis, partly along the lines that E.P. Thompson challenged those theses in 1965, by stressing, as Thompson did, the importance of political economy and the importance of natural science to British ideology. These aren't characteristic of aristocratic formations, but in many ways as well. To answer your specific question, I make a kind of very kind of Latin American, recherche Latin American joke about the left declinists. Yeah. And that is that they're just like Latin American dependency theorists, dependistas. Yeah. And what do they have in common? Actually, not Marxism, but nationalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Once you scratch below the surface, I realize I'm being controversial. Scratch below the surface, dependency theorists and nationalists are fundamentally critics of free trade and proponents of Listian national development. Yeah. So my big argument against the New Left Review critiques of the 60s is they're basically nationalist critiques. And they are nationalists just as the Social Democrats are nationalists and just as many conservatives are nationalists. So anti-imperialism is a classic nationalist position. And you have anti-imperialists of the right in post-war Britain, Enoch Powell, and you have many anti-imperialists of the left. Much more obviously, but the critique of British imperialism is the same as the dependista critique of global capitalism. Indeed, imperialism is also the term that's used in that context, and that is that it's interested in itself, and systematically underdevelops the nation. Yeah. It's exactly the same argument, yeah. So the Argentine left is saying the same thing as the British left, and indeed you can mount the critique that you just did, that the politics of these positions is to create a radical modernizing bourgeoisie. Yeah. And indeed, it's no surprise that Perry Anderson in '64 and even perhaps into '65 was very keen on Harold Wilson, the classic bourgeois modernizer amongst British politicians of the centre left.
Absolutely, and indeed, I mean, if this was part of their hope, I think. Perry Anderson has somewhat switched his views on British membership of the European Union, but their support for entry in the 70s was based, I think, as part of this justification of that it would help to modernise the decrepit old British state, as they always saw it. So
yes, I have to look into that, but certainly, I think Tom Nairn is writing in the 70s on these questions is exceptionally interesting, exceptionally good. I mean, one of the very few analysts actually to analyse the nationalism of the left, in fact. Though he didn't take the argument to the extreme position I just have.
So this occurred to me since we invited you onto the podcast. I read something came up on social media by Mike Davis, where he talked about how there's an Etonian clique at the heart of the New Left Review, and I wondered if part of the reason that the New Left Review was so taken with these narratives of decline, this kind of inverted nationalism, was precisely because they were such elite figures, so that they were all showering together when they're 11 years old with the rulers of the country or whatever, or people who would be rulers of the country. And I wondered if the fact of their sociological background partly helps explain why it was so alluring to them, even if they came at it from the left rather than from the right.
I mean, perhaps I wouldn't want to overdo that. They certainly weren't all Etonians. But I think there's maybe something more specific and more interesting to note, and that is that they most of the people in the New Left Review in the 50s and 60s went to Oxford or Cambridge, and they were certainly very disappointed, I think, with the official education that they got there. Yeah. So they had a very strong sense of the intellectual backwardness of a British elite educational establishments, and I think that certainly helps to explain the focus on creating a new intellectual cadre, new framings for understanding British society.
One final question on declinism, which is to ask, how far did it help lay the grounds for Thatcherism? And if you could maybe talk us through how those debates parlayed into justifying the Thatcher project, and how far Thatcher succeeded in dispelling ideas of decline, or how far that was her political project at all.
Yes, I mean, it's really important to understand that declinism was a feature of left discourse as much as right discourse. Yeah, and if you look at the mid 70s, I mean, Tony Benn is a declinist. Yeah? I mean, he's arguing you've got to take radical new approaches to the British economy because it's in an utter mess. Yeah, Thatcher's doing the same. She's also believes that things have gone very, very wrong, have done for a long time, and you need radical solutions. Of course, the radical solutions are very different. But there was a fair bit of overlap in the positions. For example, the nature of the British elite, the nature of the British civil service. Yeah. I mean, both insisted on the stories that the civil service was full of classicists and possibly historians who didn't understand the modern world and all the rest of it. Now, the left responded to the Thatcher project in a rather interesting way. It said that this isn't a real counter-declinist project. Rather, it is a radical reinforcement of the factors which caused the decline in the first place.
Yeah.
I.e. stressing finance, i.e. stressing international trade, stressing the market rather than state intervention. So even at the height of Thatcher, you get you get declinism on the left and on the right. So you get the extraordinary spectacle of a hard nationalist declinist, Corelli Barnett, writing a book called The Audit of War. The war is the Second World War, yes, again, who is celebrated amongst the Thatcherites, yeah, and indeed is taken up by Perry Anderson at the New Left Review. And my book, as you may have seen, was reviewed in the current issue, actually, of the New Left Review. And I'm rather beaten about the head with the supposed empirical riches of Corelli Barnett's analysis of the British condition. I mean, arguments that I and others disposed of many decades ago. So I'm saying to the wide world that's listening in, British historiography is a pretty strange beast, with lots of strange arguments flaring up on the left and the right, strange overlaps between left and right positions.
Yeah.
Now, did Thatcher reverse the British decline? No, absolutely not. It may have got kind of stabilised relative to much, but certainly not all of the EU. But of course, in global terms, the British declines continue to pace. But to return to the earlier point, that's largely because we've seen a radical transformation in the world economy, the emergence of Asian economies, not least, of course, China, which completely changes Britain's place in the world. A tiny change in the size of the Chinese economy has much more effect on Britain's relative position than a massive change in the scale of the British economy.
So maybe just to take a step back from, I guess, Thatcherism and put it maybe into the wider kind of context of post-war British history. I think one of the most striking subversions of conventional narrative that you undertake in the book is precisely in this post-war period. And usually this is cast as first from 1945 to say 1973, 1975. We have Keynesian social democratic welfare state, does lots of economic planning. And then we have a radical break and a shift to neoliberalism, Thatcherism, free markets, through kind of the overturning of that prior consensus. Could you just talk us through a little bit why you're unsatisfied with that conventional framing?
Yes, sure. Let me put a small reservation. It is the case that the book's treatment of the post-Second World War years is seen as the most interesting, the most novel, the most outrageous. But it's only half. It's less than half the book. It's a third of the book, actually. And I do have some, I think, original things to say about the pre-1945 period, which rather bear on my analysis of the post-war period. But let me just respond to you directly first to say, yes, I think it's really rather interesting that we have, particularly strongly for the UK, but it applies to other historically for other countries as well, this notion that from 1945, sometimes from earlier, we have something called a welfare state, we have something called Keynesianism, and that all adds up to something called social democracy. Yeah? And that all of this was overturned by something called neoliberalism in the 1970s, 1980s. And what I've done really is just to ask, where does that narrative come from? And my answer is that it comes from a particular kind of nationalist, social democratic historiography, established like the left declinism in the 1960s, which tells the story of Britain as one of radical transformation, actually typically during the war, not in 1945, where a new welfare state and Keynesianism is installed. Yeah, it's a story driven by liberals and social democrats, and they see all the creativity in modern Britain in those parties, in those fractions of the elite. And it sees that as overthrown, that consensus, which is a consensus on the centre left's ground, overthrown by Thatcherism and neoliberalism. And I just don't buy that story. Yeah,
right.
I don't buy the story that Keynesianism is central. Yeah. And I'm not alone in that. I mean, people who are great experts on this would say that. And I certainly don't buy the story of welfarism as essential. And one of my key arguments there is to undermine the story, empirically undermine the story that the welfare state is dreamt up by liberals in the Edwardian years and brought to fruition by Labour in 1945 with the help of the liberal William Beveridge in the latter years of the Second World War. I point out, as a few others also have, that the British welfare state of the interwar years, already from the 1920s, was a very comprehensive one, the most comprehensive in the world, probably, in fact, covering the working class. Yeah.
Actually, sorry, just to interject here, could you tell us a little? You might have been going on to do this, but could you tell us a little bit more about this? Because I think this interwar period is really important for how you overturn that kind of post-war and particularly welfarist narrative. And I think it's perhaps one of the periods of British history that doesn't stand out in the 20th century, perhaps as much as it should or could.
Yes, absolutely. I think there are some really important changes around the First World War, and the question of welfare is a central one. I mean, the essence of the system is the insurance principle, but it's not the same as the continental European insurance principle, in which workers pay a certain proportion of their income and receive a certain proportion of their income back in benefits. In the British case, it's a fixed rate contribution and a fixed rate benefit. Yeah, and it's also pretty universal. So every worker, nearly every worker, I should say, in the interwar years, who earns below a certain level, and that level is the level at which you start paying income tax. In other words, the working class does not pay income tax. Yeah, the working class has this special form of taxation, which is a poll tax. Yeah, well, there are two kinds of taxes. There's poll tax for welfare and consumption taxes, particularly on beer and alcohol and tobacco, both deeply regressive taxes. Yeah, that's the key point. Yeah, and the point about the insurance principle is that if you use a flat rate, the poorer workers will ensure that the contributions are kept low, and therefore benefits are kept low as well. So it's an extraordinary system of that acts to automatically limit welfare expenditure. Now, this applies to health insurance. It applies to unemployment insurance, and it applies to the old age pension and the widow's pension. It's a pretty comprehensive system that's created in the 20s on this insurance principle, on this particular version of the insurance principle.
And this is a lot earlier than often the welfare state is thought to have begun.
Well, precisely, because the standard story that Labour tells itself is it created the welfare state and there was no welfare before that. Yeah, and the argument is particularly made around health, as if there was no publicly financed health in the UK before the National Health Service. It's completely untrue. There's a very extensive public hospital and health insurance system. Yeah, one could argue it's one of the better ones in the world, in fact. But that gets written out, and the fact that that if you're unemployed in the United Kingdom in the interwar years, with some very few exceptions, you would have received one or other sorts of benefits. So very low levels of benefits. Yeah. And done in not always very pleasant ways, but the benefits were there. You did not starve if you're unemployed in the United Kingdom.
The state capacity was there, the infrastructure was there. I guess to kind of
absolutely
with this as the context, how does this then I guess inform this sort of overturning of that post-war narrative? So I kind of asked you a question, then asked you another question to push it back in time. But the post-war question, to return to that one.
Yes, exactly. So then you are with this new picture, the interwar years. You can ask more precisely, well, what is the difference between the post-45 welfare state and the interwar welfare state? And there are a number of interesting answers. The first is that it's more universal. It goes from 80% to 95% of the population in terms of coverage. It is much more centrally controlled by the state, by civil servants, rather than being managed by sometimes private agencies. It's much better coordinated. The different bits all come together in essentially one system. And in the case of health, you have a single national system rather than lots of local systems. And crucially, health is financed through taxation, not through this insurance principle. So we have a process of nationalization and a extension of the universalism of the system. If you look at total expenditures, one sees that actually the increase between the 1930s and the 1940s isn't that great. Yeah, it's maybe a 50% increase. Yeah. But what increases more over that same period in terms of state expenditures is military expenditure. Yeah. So that makes you think about the British post-war state in a very different way. It's not just a welfare state, which is the straightforward reading of 80% of the historiography. It's also a warfare state, as I called it. And if you think about the economy, what are the great changes? Well, Keynesianism is just part of the story, but Keynesianism isn't really possible, without a well delineated national economy. And what makes the economy national? The answer: import controls of many sorts, actually. So you go from a country that had been quite exceptional in its orientation towards free trade, to a country which becomes like other countries in imposing import controls. Indeed, there are great drives after 1945 for the United Kingdom to become as self-sufficient as possible, not least in food. It would have been unthinkable to an Edwardian liberal to aim for British self-sufficiency in anything, but particularly in food. An insanity. And becoming like Germany or France was tantamount to impoverishing oneself. So the broad argument then is that if you compare, actually not just with the interwar years, but actually with World War II, we have a nationalization of the economy, I say a nationalization of society, a nationalization of ideology as well.
So what happens to change this in the 70s? This is the kind of from that point, how do we get to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, not everybody is reconciled to this new national protectionist Britain. There are pressures to liberalise the economy. Indeed, attempts to get into the common market in the late 50s, early 60s are precisely about liberalising the British economy. It's not about going into a protectionist Europe. It's about leaving a protectionist United Kingdom. I think although I want to insist that there are some important successes in state-led modernisation after the war, there are failures, there are irrationalities there. So some people do want to get rid of these programs. But most important of all, I think, is something that's not uniquely British, which is that you have the rise of the trade union movement. The trade union movement peaked not in 1945 or 1955 or 1965, but 1979, actually, in terms of membership and density. So we've got a challenge from the organised working class, and we have the rise of the left. And I would argue that only in the 1970s that you get, a serious, sustained, social democratic, strictly speaking, critique of British capitalism, which informs labour programmes, in a way it hasn't done since 1945, really. So, from the point of view of the British elite, the British financial industrial elite, the world looks rather threatening in the 1970s. So we have what I call in the book a rulers' revolt. At a certain point, this elite says, we're not taking this anymore. We are going to counterattack, and they do that very, very, very effectively. And I don't see this just as a matter of markets. It's one reason I object to the term neoliberalism. This isn't the result of kind of new ideas about the effectiveness of markets, as opposed to old ideas about the effectiveness of the state. This is about a rebalancing of the economy and society in favour of the owners of property. So one of the points I make in the book actually is to look at real interest rates, and there are two periods where there are very high real interest rates, and that's the early 1920s especially, but through the 20s, and the 1980s. And what do high real interest rates do? Well, they take money from borrowers and give it to those who have lent, and more generally redistribute money from the property-less to those with property.
Right.
So I mean, that's not to do with markets. That's to do with the power of property.
So the wealth driving the change rather than the market activities
in themselves. Exactly. I mean, you could argue that it's market activities themselves that do it, but I want to resist that argument. I want to say, well, and certainly something like that is also happening. But there are some also very direct ways in which the state acts to redistribute income and wealth.
So I wanted
for example, to go back to the question of taxation. There's a great play made of the reduction of taxes. Well, it's only the reduction of income taxes, consumption taxes, regressive taxes, VAT, and indeed national insurance contributions go up, and they remain regressive, not anywhere near as regressive as they had been in the interwar years and indeed in the 40s and 50s, but they were still more aggressive than the national insurance tax was more aggressive than income tax. So this isn't the market. You're putting up regressive taxes says it all.
Yeah. One, I suppose I'd like to talk a bit about how the new dispensation is absorbed by the Labour Party when it reforms as New Labour. And also to tie that into the wider narrative arc in the book. So one overarching theme in the book seems to me to be it's principally the Labour Party that builds the British nation, and that is there at the kind of peak of the formation of the British nation in the mid-century point. Whereas the Tories, through their commitment to empire in the first part of the century and then later under Thatcherism, their adoption of a more liberal globalism, they always had a more internationalist connection across the 20th century. At least this is the way I understand the story you want to tell. So I suppose I wanted to, if the Labour Party helped build the British nation, I wondered if the implication was that it was also the Labour Party that unravelled the British nation, a process that started with Mrs. Thatcher, but that ended with New Labour, and particularly perhaps in the part of the story that you don't tell in the early years or the first decade of the 20th century. And I'm thinking here not only of constitutional devolution in Scotland and Wales, but also the general disintegration of the idea of a public, of a nation, in effect, of a single kind of political entity that could be consciously directed by the state.
Yes, absolutely. I see that the Tory party into the 1950s as imperialist rather than national in orientation, and that's an important part of the book, actually, to argue that there is an imperial identity on the right, not a national identity. I mean, Labour had been a free trading party into the 1930s, but I see it becoming the party of the nation from 1945 onwards. And it remains the party of the nation. I think even under Neil Kinnock. I mean, he insists that the party is the party of production. It's the party that's going to save the nation from the ravages of Thatcherism, and that's the central claim that Labour wants to make under Kinnock. New Labour is indeed different. Yeah. New Labour throws out old Labour's nationalism, its interventionism, its declinism. Actually, it insists essentially that the British economy is doing well. It embraces globalization. There is no alternative to globalization. It continues the privatization of key state functions, not least in health. The care homes, massively privatized under New Labour, not under the Tories. Actually, PFI schemes, strange financing systems for hospitals and schools, really only gets going under New Labour. So yes, New Labour undermines the capacity of the state to act. There is, however, a certain kind of nationalism in New Labour, which focuses on a certain notion of British exceptionalism, which sees the UK as global. Yeah, so it's a kind of Edwardian liberal thing again. And global Britain is a phrase used by Gordon Brown, and Gordon Brown also wants to create a British nationalism as against a Scottish and a Welsh and an Irish nationalism. They can't possibly call it nationalism because, from his position, nationalism is only something that enemies of the United Kingdom or indeed the British Empire could possibly believe in. You cannot, by definition, be a United Kingdom nationalist, because nationalism is bigoted and small-minded and insular, and the United Kingdom is by definition global, outward-looking, and generally exceptional. So New Labour is a strange beast. It does have a certain nationalism, but also a very particular kind of internationalism, which kind of leads it into Iraq, for example.
So just a question maybe on the, I guess, intellectual roots or precursors of New Labour. One fascinating trope that you develop in the book is how far so many of the themes that would become familiar under New Labour were actually developed in the old British Communist Party and its now defunct magazine Marxism Today. Could you tell us a little bit about this unexpected story?
Yeah, well, maybe not the old Communist Party. I think, should we call it a new Communist Party of the late 70s and 1980s, the New Times Communist Party of Marxism today. They're not tankies, if I can use the vernacular. Yeah. Yes, there is development of the idea that we've gone into a radically new kind of capitalism, that we've left Fordism and we're now in a post-Fordist stage. We don't have mass production. We have something called flexible specialization. Consumption is the issue, not really production anymore. The old manual working class is finished as a motor of history. Yes, and these are all things that are indeed taken up by by New Labour, but I gloss it in the following way. I don't think these ideas, the new communists, were original to them. I mean, they they were reading the bourgeois magazines and reframing existing stories a little bit, just as Perry Anderson and Tom Nairn, were reading bourgeois magazines in the 1950s and 1960s and retelling those declinist stories in Marxist language. But yes, I'm obviously a critic of the New Times stuff, and indeed I was at the time. I remember people going on about the end of Fordism and the end of mass production at the very moment when the British state supports the Ford Motor Company, no less, in creating a massive car engine factory in Bridgend in South Wales, which I think is only just closed, actually. I mean, it's not about studying realities. It's about telling very particular stories. And one of the things I try and do in the book is to study economic, material realities, whether it's trade or production or armaments, because I think they tell a very different story to the stories that we get, from reading the monthlies, from following parliamentary debates. I think the old British elite was very knowledgeable about industry and imports and exports and armaments and all these things, and concern about these things was central to their administrative and political practice. But that's no longer the case.
I just want to throw in another question before we wrap up with our final question, but would you accept what would be, so the declinist case about the British elite in the past, that they're all, like we said, kind of effete classicists who don't understand industry and commerce and logistics and organization and so on. Is that a better characterization of the British elite now? I mean, not necessarily classicists, but this that they're all PPEists, that they don't have the kind of the Cummings vision of the British elite and the cadre of the civil service. Are they decayed, would you think, by the standards of the past?
I mean, you're certainly right that I take the view that the old elite is not as it was characterized by Cummings and so on. The new elite is a very different elite. I think it is relatively less competent compared to the elites of other countries, and I don't say that because I suddenly turned into a declinist. I think it's itself a product of relative decline and a product of the particular political economy that has been followed over the last 20 or 30 years, where you effectively hollowed out the ability of the state to act. I say one could have had a very different kind of state elite, but I think the point about competence is a lack of competence is an important one. I mean, if I'm to caricature, if the British might well have had an image of themselves, at least the political and administrative class, as being superior, sophisticated kind of men of the world in the 1950s and 1960s, and might well have regarded at least some continentals as romantic and delusional and corrupt and playing to the gallery. I mean, in the view of, and I mean, people around the world might have shared elements of that caricature, but today the picture is self-evidently very, very, very different. That people like Michel Barnier look like a British figure from the 1950s and 1960s, and David Davis and Boris Johnson and Liam Fox look like dodgy Southern European politicians of British caricatures of the time. And I think there is a genuine reversal there, which has certainly not escaped the attention of foreigners.
Yeah,
I mean, it is I think the older elite would have been revolted by the current crop. Indeed are. I mean, you only have to look at people like Nicholas Soames and Chris Patton and so on, to see that they don't see themselves in this current generation.
Yeah. So last question is, I suppose, to see if it's possible to find the beginning in the end, or the end in the beginning, because you note that by the end of the 20th century, or the eve of the 21st, it seems to be something of a return. Well, I say you note. I mean, this is the way I read the story, or the narrative that you tell. It seems a return to the start of the 20th century for Britain. So London is basking in this neo-Edwardian kind of cosmopolitan glamour with its haute cuisine. British capitalism is globalized again. Britain is involved in all these small imperial wars again as part of a liberal globalist vision. It's no longer the center of the world, and its wealthy elite are Indian and Russian oligarchs rather than British industrialists and financiers. But I suppose I wanted to check if you saw that as part of the tale of Britain in the 20th century, and if there's perhaps another way to summarize what happens across the 20th century, is it liberal globalism and the nationalist kind of interlude of the middle of the 20th century, and then a return to liberal globalism?
There's something in that, and that is part of the argument of the book. But there's some heavy ironizing going on here. I certainly want to argue, and this is part of the book we haven't really touched on, that in 1900, actually right up into the 30s and 40s, the United Kingdom really is unique in the world. It is open to the world in a way no other big state is, and that openness is central to its nature. That changes radically. The United Kingdom ceases to be unique, and it has not returned to being unique. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of places in the world that are globalized in the way the UK is today. Yeah. But I would insist on the point about London being different. Yeah? Yeah. I mean, London is a global city with now limited connections to the rest of the country. It is a radically cosmopolitan place. I mean, London was different in many ways in the Edwardian years, but it's a place where British capital was exported to the rest of the world, and the income from that capital came back into the UK. Today it's foreign capital which dominates in London. The British infrastructure is very often owned by foreign capital, in just the way that the British once owned the infrastructure of half the world. Yeah. So there's now a really radical disconnect, between London and the rest of the country, between the economics of the City of London and the economics of the United Kingdom. So yes, one can see London returning to its Edwardian pomp in many ways. Yeah, but it's not the center of an empire. It's not the center of world trade anymore. It's a nice place for oligarchs to live. It's a very different sort of thing. I mean, we have foreign oligarchs financing a big chunk of British conservative political life. Yeah. Unthinkable in the Edwardian years for obvious reasons. Now, that doesn't make me a declinist. I'm saying it's actually British politics has become like the politics of, a banana monarchy.
Yeah. Well, that's a great. I think we've got our title for the episode right there, which is wonderful, actually. Banana monarchy is a great. That's a great line. Have you used it anywhere else yet?
I used it in an article in the Guardian last year.
All right. Well, we can.
Yeah, but you can
use it again. Yeah, we'll use it.
We can repurpose.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not been taken up really. So fine. Yeah.
Time for it to be podcasted then. Well, thank you very much, David. That's been it's been really wonderful to have you on, and it's been great to talk through the book.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you very much for your most interesting questions, all of you.